Welcome back to the discussion, Mitigating Cyber Risks to Ensure Business Continuity, sponsored by Akamai on Federal News Network. My guest today, Patrick Sullivan, Chief Technology Officer of Security Strategy at Akamai. Patrick, we were talking about NIST and the new guidelines they have. How is this going to impact the people at the DoD and all throughout the federal government as far as business continuity goes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the fantastic things about NIST is how thoughtful they are when they make recommendations. It's recommendations for the next 10 years, not for the next 10 weeks. And I think one of the things that we could draw from in that NIST paper that's in draft today is they talk about zero trust being a philosophy, something that you implement over time. It's not a big bang or a single product that you go, make a swap out on a technology stack overnight. I think the way to think about it is more of a philosophy is as you're making individual IT and security decisions, this is a philosophy to keep in mind. So I think one way that you could consider that in the face of a surge of remote access is, every network's a little bit different, but you may, face a challenge of, do we double down on expanding capacity of remote access that's a piece of hardware at our corporate data center, or do we use this as an opportunity to move further down that spectrum of zero trust? And so an example there could be making the decision of starting with potentially contractors or third parties who are potentially at a higher risk than a government employee, and maybe moving them to a zero trust solution to give more capacity and at the same time reduce the risk of that community. Another approach in the short term could be moving web applications to zero trust. Those are very, very easy place to get started down the path of zero trust. And the nice part there is you may be able to extend access to those applications to somebody who's working remote without requiring government furnished equipment. So you may be able to do that without a client. And that solution would then make an access decision of, given the posture of that device, the sensitivity of that application on an app by app basis, somebody may be able to be fully functional without the government, having all of the hardware and IT cost of supporting that endpoint.
If you look around what's happened in the last 3 or 4 months here, we see data centers are accommodating this big surge by bumping up existing architecture like more hardware. You just mentioned some. Some federal IT managers have been busy provisioning new remote users as well. So you get push and pull from both ends of the systems here. So what does all this change mean for business continuity?
Yeah, I think it's, planners always have a very difficult job and nobody has an infinite budget. So most organizations, made somewhat of a risk capacity planning decision of, on a given day, we have X% of our workforce that works remotely. We want to plan for a worst case scenario, and maybe that's a snow day in the Washington, D.C. area. Everybody has a different contingency they plan for. But with a hardware solution, unfortunately, you pay for whatever you build. So if you're building, a stadium to accommodate the Super Bowl, does that go unused, for 364 days out of the year? The nice part about sort of a SaaS or a cloud model is you pay for what you use. You have that scale, the ability to scale up, into the hundreds of terabits a second. But you only pay for what you use. So you don't have to make that perfect decision, how much capacity do I pay for that goes unused, or how much risk do I accept that should our requirement for remote access spike, I can only accommodate X percentage of users. One of the big advantages I think we've seen of a cloud model in recent years.
If you look at what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 months, what we see is an increase in distributed denial of service attack. And traditionally they go after data. And everyone's sort of, data breaches. But I think what's happening today is we see these attacks focusing in on VPN technology. What's going on here? We got a whole new attack vector, don't we?
Yeah, I think remote access has certainly been in the news for the last 6 to 9 months. As much as anything as an initial point for a data breach, there's been a round of vulnerabilities in many of the remote access solutions on the market. NSA has issued repeated warnings, as have their peers in the UK and Australia and other places around the world. I think some of that gets down to the complexity of supporting both legacy applications and then also modern web applications, which have a very different attack surface. So that has been, we've seen that from state-sponsored attackers all the way down to financial attacks to ransomware attacks. Now, the initial point of infiltration could be the remote access solution. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other area you spoke about is just the increased risk around the availability of the remote access solution, making sure that it's resilient in the face of a DDoS attack. Many attackers know to target somebody when they're at their weakest point. And right now, I think almost every organization's remote access is more strained than it's been probably ever. So I think that's the fear is what is the risk of DDoS targeting at exactly the wrong time and just making sure that you have resiliency to thwart those type of attacks.
Patrick, we know you got a lot of experience in this field, and you can remember 10 years ago when federal leaders talked about moving to the cloud, like it was one cloud over somewhere over Kansas or something, you know. Perhaps they should have used the plural, clouds. Today, the federal government lives in this multi-cloud environment. So is another challenge. So what kind of new challenges does this multi-cloud, you know, mean for federal leaders as far as continuity goes?
Yeah, John, you're exactly right. I mean, I think the dominant architecture that we see is hybrid multi-cloud. You know, it seems from almost every organization, there's some compute that's still going to live in your own data center. So you've got some co-location that you maintain, and then seldom do you see an organization move everything to a single cloud. Almost invariably, you know, the productivity suite tends to gravitate towards one cloud or SaaS provider. You know, developers have an affinity for maybe a different provider over the others. And then there's other providers that do specialty things like artificial intelligence. So it sort of seems that most organizations just gravitate towards hybrid multi-cloud. And I think really the challenge there for security architects, or opportunity, depending on how you look at it, is where do you deploy your security controls, right? John, to your point, 10 years ago, it was really simple. You buy a box and you stick it in your data center or data centers. Problem done. You know, that was a convenient choke point. You know, today, as that compute exists, not only in your own data center, but across multiple CSPs, it seems that the prevailing wisdom is that the edge is going to be that new focal point. Gardner calls it the secure access service edge, but really the model there is, rather than trying to replicate and gain kind of a homogeneous level of visibility and security across all of these disparate clouds, which each kind of act a little bit differently in your own data center, which is certainly different than the cloud. You have a common choke point very close to the end user. That's your point of enforcement. And then from there, you can have a common set of security controls that filter the traffic out to wherever that compute lives, even if it's kind of an edge compute model that move beyond, you know, the traditional cloud that we think of. So I think that's kind of the most flexible architecture and where things are headed.
My guest today, Patrick Sullivan, Chief Technology Officer of Security Strategy at Akamai. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy, on the discussion, Mitigating Cyber Risks to Ensure Business Continuity, sponsored by Akamai on Federal News Network.